Okay, good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today for the second webinar with Marek Kiczkowiak. I'm just going to give you 30 seconds or so to allow everybody to come into the room, but please let us know in the chat box where you are joining us from. You can see how truly international we are this morning. So for those who may be less familiar with Zoom, you can find it at the bottom of the screen, the chat box. There we go, London, Spain, Warsaw, Liverpool, Madrid, Poland, Greece. So give us countries, give us cities. If you want to do Kazakhstan, hi Sarah Zamet from Malta. Hi Sarah. Germany, Beirut, Lebanon, thank you Beth. Thank you. And from Germany, from Brazil. Wow, it's very early in the morning in Brazil, I think, Marek. Very early. Well done, whoever that was. Hamburg in Germany, sunny London. Thank you, Alison.
Lots of people from Poland.
There are lots of people. Well, obviously, you have a name for yourself in Poland, Marek. Hi, Syra from Bahrain. Poland, there are lots of people, aren't there? Wow, amazing. Perfect. Okay, thank you so much for joining us. Like I said, my name is Alex and I work as part of the marketing team at National Geographic Learning, and I will be sort of hosting today's session, making sure everything runs as smoothly as possible. So just before I introduce Marek in more detail, I just want to give you some housekeeping rules for today. So we've already found the chat button, which is great, but please make sure that when you're using the chat that you are clicking on send to all attendees, okay? Not just to the panelists. So it's all panelists and attendees. This way we can have an open discussion amongst everybody rather than just to myself and Marek. So the chat box is for general comments and information like that. But if you want specific questions answered by Marek at the end of the session, please use the Q&A button at the bottom. This way, the questions kind of get held as opposed to in the chat box, they can disappear very quickly. So any specific questions in the Q&A, please. Although I will be monitoring the chat for any questions in the chat as well. Okay, what else? I know that certificates are important to many of you for your professional development. So these will be sent out to you tomorrow. So around about the same time tomorrow, in 24 hours time, Zoom will send out an automated email. And within this email, you'll have a link to the certificate. You'll have a link to the recording in case you cannot stay for the whole session. And you'll also have a link to the lesson and the lesson plan that we're providing as part of this series of webinars. Okay, I think that's everything. So without further ado, let me introduce you to Marek Kiczkowiak, who is a teacher, an author, a conference speaker, an expert on English as a lingua franca. He's also the founder of TEFL Equity Advocates and Academy, and arguably most importantly, co-author of National Geographic Learning's new adult coursebook, Voices. In other words, Marek is a very busy man, and so we're really happy to have him with us today to talk to you all about pronunciation for a global communication. So, Marek, without further ado, let me hand over to you.
All right, thanks a lot, everybody. For some reason, my name is spelled as Marek Kiczkowiak and not Marek.
That's sure.
I'm going to rename myself.
You rename yourself, Marek.
Yeah.
There you are.
All right. Awesome. So let me share my screen with you all here. If you can just let me know that you can see the slides, that would be great. And yeah, and let's get started. So as Alex said, today we'll be talking about teaching pronunciation for global communication. And why for global communication? Well, I think you're all familiar with this statistic that around 80% of all English users around the world do not speak English as the first language. I mean, depending which researcher you ask, you might get a slightly different number, but it's always around 3/4 or 80%, right? And this number is just going to further rise as, you know, people in countries like China, for example, continue learning English, there will be more and more non-native speakers using the language. So the reality of the situation is that when your students use English, in the vast majority of cases, they will be using English with other people who do not speak English as the first language, right? Yet when teaching pronunciation or when presenting pronunciation in published materials, what very often happens is that standard native speaker models predominate. And, you know, I put native speakers here in inverted commas because it's obviously a very contested term. And in English language teaching, there's plenty of evidence that those perceived as native speakers are most frequently, you know, white people from either the US, the UK, or Australia, and they speak with, you know, the standard kind of either British or American English, right? And that's typically how we teach pronunciation as well. If you don't believe me, just play any of the recordings that you've got in the books that, you know, that you've been using. And in fact, when we look at research, you know, so 80% of people who use English are non-native speakers. But can you guess what's the percentage of non-native speakers in course books? Like when you analyze recordings from published materials, guess how many, you know, what's the percentage of non-native speakers that would be there? 0, 15, 10%, 20. All right, yeah, you're very close. 16%. So in this particular study, C analyzed 5 very well-known business English course books, and there were over 800 recordings. And he found in this study that only 16% of those 800 recordings were of non-native speakers. Now, what happens as well, as Tomlinson and Masuhara notes, is that, you know, these non-native speakers tend to speak and write with the same educated English middle-class native speaker voices, right? And, you know, again, you can check that for yourself if you know, maybe after this webinar, if you know, start using your book again, try to listen to the people that speak, you know, and even though, you know, that person might supposedly be from Mexico, generally they still speak with a very standard native speaker voice, right? In fact, in that same study that I told you about, when C analyzed those 5 business English books, when he looked more closely at those recordings of non-native speakers, it turned out that only 0.5% of all those 800 recordings had voices in them that spoke with, you know, a non-standard or a foreign accent, however you want to term it. Everybody else, so like 99.5% of people just spoke with, you know, your average standard native speaker pronunciation. Now, you know, this kind of perhaps might be rooted in the perception that a lot of us have that having a foreign accent is a sign of low proficiency, right? And very often, you know, somebody might be very fluent and everything, but we hear a strong accent, even though they might be intelligible, and we say, oh, you know, that's a sign of low proficiency. It's a very kind of widespread belief in English language teaching. And also very often pronunciation practice focuses on intonation, word stress, and features of connected speech. That's something that is very, very common. And I also conducted a study where I analyzed several major published books for adults, general English books, to look at which pronunciation features are actually taught. Now, it turned out that in one of the levels, for example, in one of the books, 48% of all pronunciation practice focused on features of connected speech, such as, for example, weak forms and assimilation and so on, right? So half of the pronunciation slots were devoted to connected speech on, that was A1 level, right? So like beginner level. Now, the thing though is that research clearly shows us that connected speech is likely to make you less intelligible, not more intelligible. And I'm sure, you know, you're aware of that as well yourself, because that's the reason why it's so difficult for your students to understand people who speak very quickly. Whenever there is a lot of connected speech, it's difficult to understand, right? And so, you know, in some books, we spend 50% of pronunciation slots teaching something that research shows makes people less intelligible, not more intelligible, right? And the pronunciation features that are actually important for intelligibility are rarely practiced. In fact, in that same study that I did, it turned out that only between 5 and 33% of all pronunciation slots in the different books that I analyzed were devoted to pronunciation features that are important for intelligibility. Now, you might be wondering, what do I mean by important for intelligibility? And how do I know which pronunciation features are important for intelligibility, right? So a lot of research has been done on, using English as a global lingua franca, and you might have heard about Jennifer Jenkins' research in the late 90s, early 2000s, but that research has continued with people like, for example, David Detterding in Southeast Asia. And basically what these researchers have done is to record conversations in situations where people, use English as a global means of communication. And then they analyze these recordings to see when a misunderstanding occurs. And when they identify a misunderstanding, they analyze if that misunderstanding was caused by a problem with pronunciation. If it was, then they identify which pronunciation feature led to misunderstanding. And if you do that enough, if you analyze, hundreds and hundreds of situations like that, then you will start seeing patterns of pronunciation features that, if mispronounced, can lead to misunderstandings, right? And these are, then as a result, features that are important for intelligibility, because if we say them wrong, many people might misunderstand them, right? So can you guess which pronunciation features might be important for intelligibility? And maybe you can put that in the chat box. Some people say syllable stress, intonation, stress. Do you mean word stress or sentence stress, or what kind of stress do you mean? Ekaterina says long and short vowels. All right. Producing vowel sounds correctly. What kind of minimal pairs do you mean, Mike? Like minimal pairs to do with consonants or vowels, or what sort of minimal pairs? Consonants at the end of the word? All right. Now let's take a look at what research actually tells us about features important for intelligibility. So number one, the difference between long and short vowels, right? And the difference in quality isn't important here. What's important is the difference in length, right? I put the column before E, but it should be after E, right? So it should be peak with the long vowel. So that difference in length is crucial. Now, this vowel, as in peril, is very important for intelligibility as well, right? And it doesn't matter whether you pronounce the R after peril or not. In fact, some research suggests that pronouncing the R makes your pronunciation easier to understand in global context, right? But this vowel is very important. Then consonants, apart from the TH sound, so apart from the dental fricative, which is not really important for intelligibility, but all the other consonants are very important. So, the difference between vet and bet. Aspiration. What is aspiration? Well, if you put your hand in front of your mouth and you try to say the word pet, as in the animal that you might have at home, or keep, then you should feel a burst of air on your hand. You can try it yourself now. So say pet, and you should feel like a little burst of air on your palm, and that's aspiration, and that's very important for intelligibility as well. Consonant clusters, especially those at the beginning and in the middle of words. And what's important here as well is that all consonants in that cluster are pronounced, right? So we can't cut any elements of the cluster. Now, you can add vowels sometimes at the beginning or in the middle of the consonant cluster, and that this doesn't seem to impact intelligibility. But if you delete some of the consonants, then that does negatively impact on the clarity of pronunciation. And nuclear stress. So by this, I don't mean sentence stress, which is very often practiced in classrooms, but nuclear stress is the most prominent stress in a given short phrase or sentence, right? So compare I didn't buy the car, I rented it, with I didn't buy the car, but he did, right? So that's stress on one particular word or one particular syllable changes the meaning completely and is very important for intelligibility as well, right? Now, which features are unimportant or unhelpful? Sorry, one more, adapting your pronunciation. By that, I mean, the ability to change the way you speak in order to be easier to understand or in order to correct your mistakes and so on, right? So being flexible with your pronunciation and adapting to other people so they can understand you. Now, vowel quality is not important for intelligibility. Now, when I say this, people say, well, but surely you can't just use any vowel you want in a word like run, right? Well, of course, yeah, you can't say rin or something like this because that's just too far away from the original pronunciation. But, whether you say run or run or ran or run with a normal R, it doesn't really matter for intelligibility according to research. And the reason for that might be, if you just think about the variety in vowel pronunciation among native speakers, like that variety is crazy. Like, I mean, compare how people in New Zealand, Australia, the US, or Scotland or Ireland might say different vowels, and it's completely different, yet they kind of communicate with each other. And perhaps that's why also in international contexts, vowel quality does not seem to impact intelligibility. Word stress does not seem to be very important either, right? So it might have some impact on intelligibility according to some studies, but usually when other pronunciation problems are also present. So if there is a problem as well with consonants and so on, but on its own, word stress does not seem to have much of an impact on clarity of pronunciation. Sentence stress, also no impact. Intonation, no difference on intelligibility. And then weak forms and features of connected speech are actually unhelpful. So they can make you less intelligible rather than more intelligible, right? And this is based on a lot of different studies from different contexts. And I'll give you the reference list at the end as well. Feel free to dive in and check out some of those studies. Or maybe if you have specific questions, put them in the Q&A box and then we can answer them at the end, right? So what does this mean for teaching pronunciation for global communication? Well, I think, first of all, it's really important to focus on clear pronunciation, not native-like pronunciation, but pronunciation that is easy to understand internationally. Whether that pronunciation, has a Mexican, Chinese, or Australian accent, it doesn't matter. What matters is that that pronunciation is clear. How do we know that pronunciation is clear? Well, we have a lot of research that can help us, right? So I think we should focus on those pronunciation features that are very important for intelligibility and make sure our students can pronounce them right. That makes pronunciation clear. A second really important principle is I think that we should promote variety and also use non-native speakers as models. I think, using non-native speakers as models can be very motivating for our students because they have someone who have actually achieved what they're trying to achieve. Like, I mean, your students can never speak like someone from London or New York. That's just physically impossible for the vast majority of adult learners. However, if you have students from Spanish-speaking students, they can definitely speak English as well as Antonio Banderas or as well as Salma Hayek. If you have, you know, German-speaking students, they can speak English as well as Arnold Schwarzenegger, for example, right? And I think it can be very motivating. It is more achievable as well. It is more relatable as well. So, you know, so I think that's very important. And it's also important to distinguish between productive and receptive pronunciation. Now, productive pronunciation is, you know, what our students should be able to produce and say, whereas receptive pronunciation would refer to, you know, to helping our students understand other people, right? So, for example, connected speech is, you know, is not really a good productive pronunciation feature because it can make us less clear, right? But it's a very important thing for receptive pronunciation because our students are very likely to meet a lot of people who, when they speak, will have a lot of connected speech features, right? So it's a good thing to practice receptively. And I think it's really important as well to follow these general principles. Explain how the sounds are made, right? Show it to your students, but also when you write your own activities, it should be explained in the pronunciation box what your students should actually do to be able to pronounce a certain sound, right? And draw your students' attention to the sounds or the features that are actually important so they know what they should pay attention to when they speak. And finally, it's also important to increase the difficulty. So what happens as well when you analyze how pronunciation is presented in many published materials is that, you know, the same pronunciation features are practiced on elementary and on advanced level. So on an elementary level, you will practice weak forms and you will practice them on advanced level. You'll practice intonation on elementary level and on advanced level. It's just that the practice will involve more difficult language, right? But just like with vocabulary or grammar or, I don't know, listening skills, we want to build the difficulty, right? And there's got to be some sort of logical progression in terms of pronunciation through the levels. And I'm going to show you as well how to do this with some clear activities here, right? So let's look at how this can be done in practice. So in here, I want to show you an example from Voices Elementary, and how we teach consonants. And in here, you know, it's a low level elementary, and we focus on sounds b and v, which are very often difficult for, you know, Spanish speakers, but not just Spanish speakers. Many other speakers have problems with these sounds, right? And, you know, also with this activity and many other activities, we use non-native speakers as models of pronunciation, right? In fact, throughout the whole 6 levels of voices, what we've done is that whenever there is a pronunciation activity, there is always a native speaker and a non-native speaker model pronouncing everything, right? And, you know, the students can listen to both, choose which one they prefer. It can be a good point of discussion, but the point is that, you know, to be realistic, we really have to offer both models to our students, and this is what we've done. And I want to play this recording here for you to see, you know, to see how we've used a non-native speaker here to model pronunciation, and maybe you can guess where this person is from.
B. Berry.
Oh, for some reason it stopped playing.
Best. Ban. V. Very. Vest. Van.
So clearly for this speaker, English isn't their first language. That's crystal clear. But does it matter? I don't think it does. I mean, the pronunciation is super clear, and they pronounce the target sound that our students need to pronounce very clearly and correctly. And that's the whole point, And I think it can show to your students as well that they can achieve that same level and they can become, fluent, proficient speakers, even as non-native speakers. And I think, for a lot of, especially adult learners, sometimes, they feel demotivated or they lack in confidence because they kind of always feel like that they have a foreign accent, which is bad, and they don't sound like, those recordings that they've listened to, and it's just demotivating, really. And some people are even scared to speak because they think that, speaking with an accent is a bad thing, right? So I think it can have a very positive impact on the students as well. All right, so hold on. Now, what you will notice as well here is that we explain how the sound is made, right? So it's not enough just to tell our students, well, go and make this sound, and pronounce it correctly. I think we need to tell them how to actually achieve that, right? And, they might be, this is important as well, because they might look at it at home and practice it themselves. So they need to know how to do this. And you might already do this as a teacher and model it and explain it, and you should probably, but I think it should be in the pronunciation box as well if you're writing your own material, so the students can refer back to it and practice at home. Now, related to consonants is aspiration. So you might remember that aspiration is this short burst of air when you say voiceless plosives in stressed syllables, right? And you might think, wow, this sounds incredibly complicated. I don't know how I would ever be able to teach that to my students. But we do it, starting on elementary level, because research shows that aspiration is very important, right? And, you can start off in very simple terms with very simple words that even beginner students will understand. And it can be a very fun activity because, like, the only thing you need to show students to do is to put their hand in front of the mouth, say the word to, and feel the air on their hand. You can do it with a piece of paper as well, and the paper will move slightly when they say to, because there will be aspiration, right? Now, I also mentioned progression across levels. And of course, this is a simplified version of when aspiration actually happens, because aspiration only happens to in stressed syllables, to voiceless plosives such as p, t, and k, right? So notice that in here we just have one voiceless plosive, t, right? We don't introduce more because this is elementary level, right? It will be too much for students probably, but we build on it throughout levels. And then on upper intermediate, we have all three consonants, p, t, and k, right? And we also introduce a nuance that, these consonants have to be in stressed syllables. If they're not in stressed syllables, then there won't be any aspiration, right? And they've got to be followed by a vowel as well. Otherwise, there is no aspiration. So it's, it's much more advanced to what you saw previously with elementary. And that's what I mean by logical progression, So we're still practicing in a way the same pronunciation feature, I suppose, but in a much more advanced way, not with more advanced vocabulary or language, but in a more kind of difficult way or a more difficult aspect, And the same thing could be done with many other features, like, for example, consonant clusters, so groups of consonants together, right? So at beginner elementary level, you might want to start just with, individual consonants. And then as you go across the levels, you can introduce different consonant clusters at the beginning, in the middle of the word, with 2 consonants, with 3 consonants, with 4 consonants, and so on. And that's how you make progression across levels. And this brings me precisely to consonant clusters, so groups of consonants that come together, right? And in here we focus, this is pre-intermediate level, and we focus on the cluster stru, right? Notice that, we also tell our students that, if they find it very difficult, and a lot of students will find it difficult, is that, it's okay to insert a vowel at the beginning. So instead of strong, you can say strong, or instead of strong, you can say setron, and they will hear pronunciation like that from other people as well. But it's not okay to delete some of the consonants from that cluster, right? So we also draw their attention to what's important here and what they should be practicing. And I think that's vital as well, because when the students go back and they try to practice it, they need to know what is important. And if they're struggling, I think it provides, especially on pre-intermediate level, it provides a safety net for them, right? That okay, if saying strong is really difficult, if I say strong, it's still okay, but I should remember not to say stong, because if I say stong instead of strong, people might misunderstand that, right? And of course, on higher levels, if we go up to, intermediate, upper intermediate, we'll expect students not to put extra vowels in those clusters, but be able to pronounce the entire cluster without any problems, right? But that's, again, building progression across levels. And here's, an example of an activity that you could do with your students as well, where they practice just the st sound, right? So this is easier. This comes from, not from pre-intermediate, but from elementary, right? And they just have 2 consonants together rather than 3 consonants. So this is easier to practice. And you can see that there's a mix of, clusters. A lot of those clusters are at the end, like, largest, biggest, longest, and so on, right? Now, another thing that I mentioned that's really important for intelligibility is long and short vowels, right? So in here, that's intermediate level. There's a difference between the short u and the long u, right? And again, the quality, it's not so much the quality that's important, but the length of the vowel, right? And, sometimes you might even ask your students to exaggerate the length, because often if your students have problems with long vowels, when they exaggerate it, they'll probably get it right, So the takeaway message from here is that it's the length, right? So food, not food, but food, right? And school, it's got to be long, and as I said, I'd encourage even, especially at lower level students, to try to exaggerate it so that it sticks in the minds. And one way to practice it is through a maze like this that we developed here. And I'd actually like you to try and practice it, right? So your task is to get from the left of the board to the right of the board, starting with the word awful. But the rule is you can only step on stones that have words with long vowels, okay? So you want to get from the word awful to the other end, only stepping on words that have long vowels, all right? And you can go down, you can go to the right, you can go across, you can do whatever you want to do, but only with words that have a long vowel. So where would we go from awful? What would be the next word after awful? Yeah, absolutely, hard. And from hard, where are we going to go from hard? Yeah, from hard, we could go to start, which also have a long vowel. And from start, neat. Absolutely, yeah, neat. And from neat, where can we go from neat? Sneeze or roof? Roof has a short U, so it doesn't really work, but we could go to sneeze. So let's go to sneeze. Where can we go from sneeze? Yeah, we could go to remove, or we could go to floor, or we could go to eagle, right? If we go to, let's say we go to remove, where can we go from remove? Broom. Yeah, absolutely. We could go to broom. And after broom, we can go to morning, right? So that's kind of a simple game that you could play with your students, right? And you could change the rules and tell them to only, for example, go on words with short vowels, or you could specify, you know, the vowel they can step on and so on, right? So this is from upper intermediate. So it's much more advanced, right? And if you were doing this at lower levels, you could limit it to, for example, just two, just that minimal pair with short and long vowel, and that's it, right? Or you could just have like one target long vowel, right? On, let's say, elementary or pre-intermediate levels, right? But in here, since we're on upper intermediate, we're kind of practicing all of them. All right. The next really important point that I mentioned is adapting your pronunciation. Now, there can be kind of like three ways in which you can adapt your pronunciation. So one way is, you know, when you make a mistake, right? And you realize you've made a mistake because people are looking at you as if you were crazy and they don't know what you've said. And you correct your pronunciation and you say that pronunciation feature correctly, and then everybody understands you, right? So that's one way, just correcting your pronunciation. But the second way of adapting your pronunciation could be, for example, to reduce features of connected speech. So let's say, you know, you say a word like, you say something like, did you see the film? And people go like, what? And then you say, did you see, right? That's something we very often do as teachers, but it's very useful actually when you communicate in international contexts to be able to kind of adapt that pronunciation. So that's the second way. But there's also an interesting third way that sometimes comes up in research on international communication. And traditionally, you could view it as adapting your pronunciation to incorrect pronunciation. So what I mean by this is that, you know, for example, you might say the word salmon, that you had salmon last night, and you know, whoever you're speaking to doesn't understand what you mean with salmon. And then, you know, what researchers have noticed is that then the person kind of says salmon, and they pronounce the L, which they shouldn't, but they do, and they say salmon, I had salmon. And the other person goes, oh, right, you had salmon. Yeah, I had salmon. And then they just continue using the word salmon, you know, so they kind of arrive at what we would typically see as incorrect pronunciation, but they've adapted the way they speak to suit the interlocutor and, you know, and get the message across. And, you know, whether we like it or not that this happens, you know, is probably irrelevant because it happens, and it's, you know, sometimes you need to do this. If you want to get the job done and get your message across, you have to adapt to people around you, and you have to adapt your pronunciation. So this is one activity that we do. This is on an advanced level, right? In here, we just have one example of the word actually and how it changes to actually if we speak very quickly, right? But there's lots of other words like, you know, perhaps sounds more like perhaps when we speak quickly, right? And you know, if you say perhaps, some people might be confused as to like, what did you actually say? So it's important, especially for advanced learners, to know how they can adapt their pronunciation, and that in some situations they might want to say perhaps so that other people understand them, right? So it's kind of the opposite of what we would normally teach our students, because normally we would, you know, make them, oblige them, or whatever, practice with them to say things as quickly as possible with lots of connected speech. But, you know, this isn't always necessary. In fact, in many situations, it's actually unhelpful. Students need to be able to adapt their pronunciation to suit their interlocutor and get the message across. And another point that I mentioned was nuclear stress, right? And nuclear stress is different from sentence stress, you might remember, because it's the most prominent stress in a given utterance, right? So here I've got an activity from Voices Upper Intermediate teacher's book. And what happened in what we want students to do here is to read the sentences in different ways, depending on the question that is asked. So if I ask you, who asked you to buy flowers, you will have to stress Sylvie, right? Who asked you to buy flowers? Sylvie asked me to buy flowers. What did Sylvie do? Sylvie asked me to buy flowers, right? What did Sylvie ask you to do? Sylvie asked me to buy flowers. What did Sylvie ask you to buy? Sylvie asked me to buy flowers, right? So you see, like the stress, the most important stress, the nuclear stress falls on a specific word, and that changes the meaning completely, right? You could also say, well, who did Sylvie ask? Well, Sylvie asked me to buy flowers, not you, right? So that's a very important as well aspect of pronunciation that is frequently overlooked, because very often we practice sentence stress and we get students to put those like dots above the syllables that are stressed, but that's not really the point. The point is to be able to, to put stress on the most important word in a given utterance and get the nuclear stress correct in order to be easy to understand, right? Now, moving on to some kind of more general principles, I think it's really, really important as well to promote variety. I think for much too long, we've been promoting kind of and teaching a very, really antiquated version of the English language that is spoken, as Tomlinson and Masuhara noted, mostly by, middle-class, educated, standard native speaker voices. And this, of course, not only just excludes, 80% of English users who do not speak English as a first language, but it also excludes a huge number of native speakers who simply don't happen to have a standard native speaker pronunciation. And that's most native speakers, right? Most speak with some sort of an accent. And, when I give talks like this, sometimes I'm approached by native speakers who don't speak with standard pronunciation, and they say, like, how bad they felt over the years when they play a recording to students, and this recording just sounds completely different to how they would speak, and they feel like a fraud, like a complete fake. And and I think this can be really liberating, first of all, for teachers. But also, second thing, it's important for students, right? It's more realistic, it's more achievable, it's more authentic, and otherwise, I think if we just kind of serve our students a lot of standard accents, and we're doing them a disservice, because then they will go out to the real world and listen to how Brazilian, Chinese, Polish people speak English, and they'll have problems understanding them. So we have to promote variety. And in terms of pronunciation specifically as well, there is lots of different ways of pronouncing the same sound that doesn't have any influence on how easy or difficult it is to understand you, right? And the case in point here is the dental fricative th, right? The th. So, typically, we'll practice it a lot with students and get them to say th, the dental fricative voiced and voiceless. But research clearly shows us that this sound isn't important for intelligibility. So if you say th as f or t, that's not a problem at all, right? And in fact, a lot of, if you wanted to follow, how native speakers use the language, well, a lot of native speakers actually say th. For example, a lot of native speakers in London or in the United States, they don't say think, but think. And, in Ireland, for example, many people say think with a T sound, not think, right? And again, this has no impact on intelligibility, right? So let's take a look at how we did it here with this example of 3 different speakers.
1. Think, think, think. The.
2. Think, think, think.
D. D. D.
3.
Think. 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 V. V. V.
Right, and also notice that, we can give students a choice. So, rather than impose something on them, we can point out the variety and then just simply ask them which pronunciation they prefer, why, and have a conversation about it. You don't have to impose anything on your students, and it can turn into a very interesting conversation about, whether they've heard these different ways of pronouncing things, which they prefer, why, and so on, right? So it opens a lot of possibilities, and this can be done with lots of other words and sounds and so on, right? Now, I also mentioned productive and receptive pronunciation. So productive is what I've been showing you thus far. So like the pronunciation features that our students should be able to say, right? Productive. Receptive, on the other hand, refers more to like listening skills, being able to understand certain pronunciation features. So here's, an example of how words change in fast speech from pre-intermediate. And notice that really, we do the opposite of what would be typically done. Typically, what would be done here is students would be required to practice did you, right? And they would be required to say, did you, what did you do, right? To have that connected speech, right? We do the opposite. We tell them that it can be a good idea sometimes to speak more slowly and more clearly so that people can understand you. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that our students always have to say, what did you do? Because they can sound ridiculous when they do that, right? And they're not going to make any friends. But sometimes, they need to be aware of the fact that, saying, what did you, can have a negative impact on clarity, and some people might misunderstand them, and they need to know what to do instead, right? And so it comes back to being able to adapt your pronunciation as well. So, with that said, let's recap some of the important principles for teaching pronunciation for global communication. Well, first of all, focus on clear pronunciation, not native-like pronunciation, but focus on pronunciation features that will help your students sound clear. And we have, good indication of what those features are because a lot of research has been conducted on it. So we're not drawing those features out of thin air and inventing them. There is a lot of evidence that points us into a certain direction. Number two, promote variety and use non-native speakers as model. I think that's crucial. Just as we want to, promote variety in terms of like, who we present in pictures in course books and the topics that we use and so on, we need to do the same here. Like English has changed, right? 80% of people who use it do not speak it as the first language, and we need to acknowledge that. And we need to acknowledge as well the incredible variety of, of native speaker voices and all the different accents that people have and the way they pronounce different words and so on. And I think it's really important to bring that into our classrooms. Distinguish between productive and receptive pronunciation. Productive is for speaking, receptive is for listening, right? And in general, try to follow these principles as well. Explain how the sounds are made. You can show it to your students and so on, but I think it's important to put it down on paper. If you're writing your own materials and have a pronunciation box, put it on paper to explain to students what they should do. And draw their attention to what's actually important and what they should pay attention to. And finally, increase the difficulty, right? So don't just practice the same connected speech feature on advanced and pre-intermediate level, just with different sorts of language, but try to raise the difficulty, right? So if, on elementary level, we practice single consonants. On pre-intermediate, we want to practice consonant clusters with 2 sounds. And then on intermediate with 3 sounds. And then maybe in the middle of the word as well. And then on upper intermediate, you know, it just goes up and up the difficulty and our expectations, just as you would with vocabulary, grammar, and everything else. The same principle applies to pronunciation. So here are some of the references, right? You can look them up. And if you want to read any of those studies, you don't have access to them, feel free to send me a message and I'll be very happy to share them with you. And with that said, thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed the talk, and now we can answer any questions.
Yeah, first of all, Marek, thank you ever so much. There's been some fantastic chat all through the chat box. Lots of great comments. So clearly, you know, this is a topic which is very close to teachers' hearts and one that they want to know more about. And there's some questions in the chat box I'm going to pose to you as well, Marek, while you grab a glass of water. So something that sort of popped up a few times was this idea of managing expectations of students. You know, we know students, they want to sound as native as possible. How do we manage those expectations, those kind of clear pronunciation goals for our learners, do you think?
Sure. So I think, first of all, we need to ask ourselves the question, like, how many students actually want to sound like that? Because some might, others might not, right? So that's I think the first thing. Now I think the second question to ask ourselves is like, why do they want to sound like a native speaker? And a very likely reason for a lot of people is that, you know, this is what we've made them to believe that they should sound like through how we've been teaching the English language. Because if you think about it, you know, if you always show your students models of, let's say, standard British pronunciation, well, it's no surprise that students will want to sound like that. You know, another reason is, of course, the reason of prestige, you know, and this happens among native speakers as well, that, you know, some native speakers are kind of obliged, or they feel like they have to standardize their accent in order to kind of whatever, for prestige reasons, right? So I think these are some important kind of considerations to make. And I think I would talk to students, like in some of the activities that we showed here. Like, you can just show them, you know, different ways of pronouncing TH, for example, right? And then ask them and open it to a discussion. You know, don't impose anything on them. Don't necessarily judge them, whether they're right or wrong in believing something, but have a conversation about it. And I think it can be a very, you know, interesting discussion. If you have, you know, people from different countries in your class, or if you have, you know, let's say 10, 15 students, there'll be different views probably there on that, right? And I think it'll be interesting to discuss. And ultimately, you know, if your student still insists, well, look, but I really want to sound like this person, I think, you know, I've had students like that, and I'm very upfront with them, and I'll just say, like, look, you know, all research that we have about second language acquisition clearly shows that as an adult learner, it's practically impossible to be able to sound like a native speaker. That's just a fact, right? So, you know, we can try, and we'll try to get as close as possible, but just so you know, it's almost impossible to do that. And then, you know, we should probably talk about like why you feel you need to sound like that, why you feel like having a foreign accent is a bad thing, right?
And just on that note, Mark, I'd like to add, I think you're pretty aware of the famous quote by David Crystal, right? About, you know, the only person who needs to sound, the only language learner that needs to sound like a native speaker is a spy, right? So unless your students want to be spies working within the UK, then, you know, they don't need to have that perfect British accent.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Another question that's come up a few times in the chat as well as in the question box, Marek, was this idea of that kind of the split between, yes, we don't necessarily need to teach them to sound like native speakers, but they still need to understand them, and that issue of connected speech, right? Mm-hmm. So how can we kind of marry those two ideas together?
Yeah, sure. So I think, like I've tried to show you in some of the activities in Voices, that, you know, there should be a clear distinction. So you might have, you know, activities that will be devoted strictly to kind of receptive pronunciation skills and helping your students understand fast connected speech. And then, you know, rather than being devoted to kind of pronouncing that connected speech, right? And if you feel your students need more practice, then probably you need to put even more emphasis on actually understanding, let's say, connected speech and different features of connected speech rather than producing it, right? If your students have problems with it. So I think, you know, you can marry the two.
Perfect. There's another question which is right up your alley here, Marek, about a teacher basically applying for a job that requiring a native speaker of English. How can we overcome that issue? So she's lived in England since childhood, but she's got a Polish name, and that's the first thing people see on her applications.
Yeah, sure. Well, I think I would probably ask myself a question whether I actually want to work for an employer who sees, you know, your first language as the most important qualification. I personally wouldn't, right? I might be, you know, speaking from a privileged position where I can, you know, choose different jobs, but there is plenty of fish in the sea, not sea in the fish. So what I'm trying to say is, you know, you probably don't want to work for an employer like that anyway, who kind of prefers to hire people just because they happen to be born in England. So that would be the first thing. But now the second thing, if you like really need a particular job and you're applying for it, what I would do is, you know, is try to, for example, send a video CV, right? And you know, just showcase your skills through a video, and then they can see that video, right? I would, and I do that on my CV. I delete any reference to like where I come from. So I don't put my nationality because it's completely irrelevant, as I don't put my age or gender or sexual orientation, or all these things that are completely irrelevant to my ability to teach the language, right? And even when I put the languages that I speak, what I do is I don't put Polish and then native language. I put, you know, I actually put English first, and I put English C2, Spanish C2, Polish C2, French B2, and I just list them on the Common European Framework, you know. And so these are some kind of simple things that you could do. And importantly, you should also be aware that it's illegal to reject your job application based on your first language or your nationality, you know. And you know, ultimately that's something that, you know, you could bring to the attention of an employer as well, if that happens.
Perfect, thank you for that, Marek. And I guess with that, we are at the end of the session. So I want to say another really big thank you to Marek for sharing with us all of his ideas, all of his thoughts on, you know, pronunciation for global communication. I think, you know, judging from the chat, everyone's been thoroughly engaged, and again, it is a topic which is important to people. Just want to remind you, as I said at the beginning of the session, that you will receive a Zoom email tomorrow morning around about the same time. And within this, you will have a link to the certificate. You'll have a link to the recording, and you'll have a link to the lesson plan and the pages from the Voices coursebook. In addition, you will get another email from National Geographic Learning, just in case that ends up in your junk or your spam box. So just keep an eye out for it. Also, there is more National Geographic Learning goodness coming your way. So first of all, we have the webinars where you can catch up on any webinars you may have missed, as well as our In Focus blog, where you'll be able to see an article from Marek on this very topic. But also, please do join us, follow us on Facebook as well, using one of those options at the bottom. And then finally, this is the second of our Voices launch webinars. Last month we had Chia Swan Chong. Today we had Marek, and next month we have a session with Emily Bryson, another of the co-authors of Voices. Again, there'll be two sessions, one on the 23rd of March in the evening and one on the 25th of March in the morning. So if you want to watch that, scan the QR code and it'll take you to the registration page. Otherwise, you can check out the hub, which will be sending you a link to as well in the follow-up email. So thank you to all of you once again. And an even bigger thank you to Marek, and I wish you all a lovely weekend. So take care, stay
Thank
safe.
you.
Bye for now.
Bye.